Rude. Good morning. We UU band of hardy souls. Is it damp enough for you? I'm Pat Solomon, a worship associate at UUCC. We especially welcome any guests who are visiting us for the first time, either physically or joining in the cyber world. Our services seek to create connections with others and within, enrich our spiritual values, and represent our calling to live lives of equity and compassion. We come from different places, different religions, different beliefs, and different backgrounds. We hope you will find comfort, connection, challenge, and love here. We are a welcoming congregation, and you are welcome here to be your whole selves. If you're interested in more information about who we are, you are welcome to fill out one of the guest cards in the pew rack. You can place it in the offering plant so we can reach out to you and answer any questions you might have. If you're watching from an Internet Connect platform, please go to our website at uucleveland.org or send an email. On the back of your order of service is a QR code, and it will tell you what to do with that. We are about to enter into sacred space. Please take a moment to silence your phones or other electronics that beep. This morning, our chalice lighter is my friend Valerie McFadden. Valerie has been an active member of the Unitarian Universalist Society of Cleveland and UUCC since 2001. At the Society, she was on the board and a ministerial search committee. She has been a worship associate at both, and here she is on the racial leadership team. And the reason we have asked her to be the chalice lighter is because we are honoring the new members of the board, and Valerie is a new member of the UUCC board. Thank you.
As we light our chalice this morning, I invite you to read along our covenant on the yellow pew cards. Thanks especially to Brian Larson, who made sure we had these in the pews for our worship service this morning. We cultivate trust with one another by celebrating differences, honoring boundaries, and offering compassion and care. We listen to each other deeply with curiosity and wonder. We speak for ourselves without need to defend ourselves or persuade each other. We create safe and brave space for healthy conflict, creativity, and fun. We reconcile through forgiving and making amends when we hurt one another. Thank you, Valerie. And good morning. I'm the Reverend Randy Partain. My pronouns are they, them, and I am delighted to be with you in worship today, whether you're joining us online or here in person, where we gather on lands once occupied by the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg peoples, also known as the Three Fires Council, comprised of the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Ottawa tribes. We are called to worship this morning by the words of Elizabeth Mount. From our very first breath, we reach out. Co-regulation, not self-regulation, is in our nature. We find our cues from the sun and the moon, from each parent and caregiver. We find our place in this great turning planet by turning to one another. Generation to generation, we awaken to the dawn and fall asleep at the evening's end. Our life's journey is a part of something greater, something simple, something divine. A flame cannot be lit without a spark. A life cannot begin without air, and we cannot begin to find ourselves without love. May we reach out to one another. May we offer love and nurturing care. May we join together in celebration of the interdependence of our lives as we begin worship together. And in just a moment, we are going to unironically sing hymn number 66, With Hope in Our Hearts, when the summer sun is shining. But before we do that, let's take a moment to welcome one another. Good morning. Welcome. That's all right. It all works. And we come now to the point in our service where we share our joys and concerns. If you're joining us online today, I invite you to put any joys or concerns you'd like to share with the congregation in the comments. And if you're here in person, you have perhaps written something in the book that you'd like to share with everyone. We do have kind of a lengthier one, a stone of joy, recognizing the many hands who provided service to our community in June. Through the helping hands and other volunteers, UUCC congregants were provided rides, a reception service, well-being calls, and more. So we thank Lori, Jan, Nancy, Barbara, Terry, Steve, Ken, Cheryl, Tom, Bob, Carol, the Laughter in Our Lives small group, and the Wisdom Seekers Covenant group. June was indeed a month to celebrate the wealth of our Helping Hands community. And we place a stone of concern for those of our Jewish siblings in Georgia who have been subjected to hate speech and demonstrations near their spaces of worship, a stone of solidarity and care. What other joys and concerns do you bring with you today? I invite you to come forward and put a stone in the water to acknowledge anything you're carrying in your heart this morning. we place a stone for those joys and concerns shared online today. There's a lot of stones in this bowl. So I hope that you take time, if not today after the service, then sometime this week, to reach out to some of the people that you know in this congregation, the people that are close to you, and share with them what these stones are about. Because in addition to this spiritual practice, we hope that in sharing our joys and concerns, that our burdens are lessened and our joys are magnified. So I hope you take time to connect with one another about just what these stones mean to you in the days ahead.
My name is Mary Schatzman, and I am a member of our congregation's UU Ministry for Earth Committee. I was raised a Southern Baptist where we were told what to believe, but as a UU for a bit more than 40 years now, I have had to engage in the difficult work of creating my own beliefs. Rather than opine about what I don't believe, here's a bit about what I do believe. I believe in the in-betweens. In the beginning was the singularity. Only when it came apart could there be any betweens. At the heart of everything is the dance between matter and energy. The who that I am is located between. The thoughts and feelings that make me distinct are in the synapses between the neurons. The life that powers me is the fire of metabolism. Breath brings the universe inside me and me into the universe. The way I live out my faith must be in the betweens, between people, between ideas. The sacred times are between the night and the day, between the seasons. Transformational times for me have been between jobs, between times with children present and times with children absent, between actions and contemplation. The boundaries, like cells, have semi-permeable membranes, allowing free movement of some energies, selective movement of others, yet they're able to maintain my wholeness and integrity of self. I take responsibility for shaping the membrane and selecting what passes between. I take power from the energy of life. I give back to that energy a uniqueness that it would lack without me. Within this interface, I can find love and joy and beauty and meaning. Within this interface, I can exert influence toward justice and peace and wholeness. That is a responsibility and the great gift of life. Words have power to shape thoughts. Labels have power to shape perception. Labels from others can nurture or harm, but labels for oneself can help with identity formation. Over my life, I've changed labels multiple times. As a UU, a label right there, I have identified as a humanist as well as a pagan. At one point in recent UU history, those were seen as being at odds with each other. But some years ago, I attended a presentation at General Assembly that was in the form of a debate between the leaders of the humanist world and the pagan world in UUism. It was a dynamic and well-reasoned exchange, and in the end, they decided that there isn't really much difference at their cores. That worked for me since I identified as both. Then after that, a new label came about called religious naturalism. The more I heard about it, the more it resonated. Religious covers both the very individual human need to have meaning in our lives and the more institutional sense of being together and supporting one another. Naturalism covers both science and direct experience of the environment as sources of life and wisdom. Between the religious and the naturalism, there is a dual call to action. I love to walk trails, and I find this brings me a needed breadth and depth of perception, which I feel both physically and mentally. I feel a responsibility to appreciate this earth, a responsibility to stay open to awe and wonder. Besides knowing birds and trees, this includes paying attention to how we humans interact with the natural world. I feel at multiple levels an imperative to consider the earth sacred as opposed to being a resource to be exploited. Which leads to the other call to action, which is to protect. Climate change is real and is caused by humans. Climate change is a direct and imminent threat to our very existence. Our being humans and other relations in this precious interdependent web. Action includes small things such as avoiding methane creation by composting food waste in our Rust Belt Riders bin. Do this. It includes big things like reducing fossil fuel usage, engaging in politics, and in risking arrest at protests. Climate change is where the rubber meets the road. What kind of world will exist for a child born in another 7 generations? If confronted by that child asking me what did I do about climate change, what could I say? What could you say? This year at GA, I heard from the Reverend Dr. Leonisa Ardizzoni that science provides us with the evidence and our faith compels us to act. After today's service, there'll be a labyrinth workshop. This is a great way to literally connect with the earth. And a possible subject for contemplation might be, what am I doing and how do I want to shape my thoughts and actions going forward? So, if we conceptualize God as the earth, it gives a different spin on the words of Micah. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God.
Every week, most of our offering is given to a nonprofit organization for a project that will advance the mission and vision of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. Projects may be internal or external to the congregation, and members are invited to make nominations. This week, the recipient will be the Unitarian Universalist the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which is a nonprofit, non-sectarian organization under the UUA umbrella, advancing human rights together with an international community of grassroots partners and advocates. UUSC's climate justice work, and that is only one of the several initiatives that they follow. This one focuses on advancing and protecting the rights of populations at risk of climate-forced displacement. The program emboldens the right to self-determination by prioritizing building protections and, when necessary and required by our partners, supporting communities to relocate with dignity. As an example, for people living in remote coastal areas of the South Pacific's Solomon Islands, the threats of climate change have become a reality. Because they are at sea level, the islands experience flooding during high tide, causing death and destruction. The rising sea levels have led to saltwater contamination of groundwater, threatening the human right to water and food. The UUSC has partnered with local organizations to help raise awareness about the climate-related human rights issues that they are facing, elevate their voices and their expertise on this issue, and highlight the human right to retain one's culture, heritage, and traditions, and advocate for government support. Here in the United States, climate change events such as these, paired with Human-made projects such as fossil fuel drilling and levee construction have irrevocably altered lands that have been occupied by indigenous people for generations. UUSC is working with 4 tribes in Louisiana and 1 in Alaska to call attention to these challenges, given that the U.S. government has not worked collaboratively with them. They are experiencing marginalization of entire communities and the complete loss of sacred lands, burial sites, cultural traditions, and livelihoods. The 5 tribes have united to submit a complaint to the United Nations. UUSC partners at the Alaska Institute Justice have been instrumental in bringing these groups together and filing the complaint. Please give generously to support the overall work of the UUSC, and for more information about its many strategic initiatives, go to UUA/UUSC.
As you may remember, we are test driving a few musical acceptance of gifts possibilities, and so I invite you to sing along with the first verse of Love Will Guide Us, found in your order of service. Love will guide us.
In the introduction of her book, The Sacred Depths of Nature, Dr. Ursula Goodenough says that she is seeking to present an accessible account of our scientific understanding of nature, and then suggest ways that this account can call forth appealing and abiding religious responses, an approach that can be called religious naturalism. If religious emotions can be elicited by natural reality, and I believe that they can, then the story of nature has the potential to serve as the cosmos for the global ethos that we need to articulate. I will not presume to suggest what this ethos might look like. Its articulation must be a global project. But I am convinced that the project can be undertaken only if we all experience a solemn gratitude that we exist at all, share a reverence for how life works, and acknowledge a deep and complex imperative that life continue. A key component of any religious cosmology is its human focus. Even as we now understand that our advent on the planet was but a moment ago, even as we now gaze into the heavens with new and urgent questions about our significance, the significance and future of humanity remain central to our religious concerns. Religious naturalism has no problem here. Being at home with our natural selves is the prelude to ecology, both environmental and cultural. And then an add-on, this is not good enough. This is Rachel Carson, remember her? Apparently, I have never made it clear that I consider my contributions to scientific fact far less important than my attempts to awaken an emotional response to the world of nature.
Taking a big risk this morning with the warm air and the white noise of the fans. This really would be the best morning for me to come around with a microphone and make sure you're all awake and responding to things. I know some of you really hate that, so you can relax. I'm not going to do that this morning. I do want to let you know, following General Assembly, that a significant number of delegates voted to continue the conversation about revising our Article 2 language. And so we are going to spend a lot of time this year on that. It was amazing. Thanks. It was amazing that some people said that they hadn't heard anything about this, that it was news to them, that they were completely surprised by this conversation. So if anyone here is feeling surprised by the possibility of us revising the Article 2 language, you have a year to acclimate, because we're going to be talking about it and exploring it and trying it on. And then at next year's General Assembly, we'll have a vote whether to actually make the change. But we're going to spend some time with it and live with it for the next year and see what we think. But not today, because some amendments have revised that language, and we're going to wait until we get that completely amended version of it before we really dig in and start exploring. So over the summer, we're going to be talking more about religious naturalism, and we're going to base a lot of that on the work on the model set by Ursula Goodenough in her book, The Sacred Depths of Nature, which just came out with a second edition we figured out after we decided we were going to do this plan. Ursula Goodenough was just elected to the National Academy of Sciences, so she's still doing important work that's getting recognized in the world. But one of the most influential things she did was she published this book several years back called The Sacred Depths of Nature. And in it, she basically says, we have a narrative just from our scientific understanding of our story. As human beings, we have a narrative that is compelling, that gives us an opportunity to respond to the natural world in a way that doesn't need any additional stories layered on top of it. We don't have to make up anything to add over top of this scientific narrative. And so in addition to the scientific narrative, Sacred Depths of Nature has her reflections, and her reflections are her own emotional response to things and how she feels compelled to interact with other human beings and the world around her as a result of, as a response to this scientific narrative about who we all are and how we got here and where the world came from and all of the things we still continue to learn about. And I think for a lot of us, we really delight in knowledge. We like knowing about the science of things. We get information, and we feel good about having information. And then we kind of stop, and we say, well, now I know things. And we feel really good about knowing things. And religious naturalism invites us to consider that the first step. Knowing things is the beginning, not the end point. Once we know things, then we can say, so how do I feel about this stuff that I know? What does this mean for me personally? If I understand where life came from and I understand that we all have a common ancestor as human beings, what does that really mean for me in my life, in my relationships? How am I going to treat other people? If I know all of these things, how is that a spiritual experience? So there's kind of three pieces to that. The understanding, the recognizing and naming our own emotional response, and then our external calling, which might be different for all of us based on the same information. We might respond in a lot of different ways. And to Ursula Goodenough and other religious naturalists, that is the spiritual work of being in relationship with the planet, which maybe, if we wanted to, we could call God or Goddess or just Earth. So I wanted to share a little story with you about my own journey recently. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that I had gone to a spiritual directors conference in Madison, Wisconsin. Madison, Wisconsin is about an 8-hour drive, and I looked at airfare to get to Madison and realized that it would take a lot more money than driving and also just as much time because there wasn't a direct flight from Cleveland to Madison for some strange reason. And so by layovers and getting onto planes and getting off of planes, I would have taken the same amount of time to get there. So I decided I would drive. And since this was a study leave thing for me, I said, well, I should not just listen to happy music and bebop down the road. I should use those 8 hours as part of the study leave and listen to some kind of spirituality-focused podcast on those 8 hours. And this was kind of a last-minute thing. I didn't have a particular podcast in mind, and there were a couple of false starts because I started listening to things and said, I'm not listening to this for 8 hours. But pretty soon, I landed on this Celtic spirituality podcast, Celtic Christianity, actually. Very different from a lot of the Christianities that I have experienced in my life, and I've experienced a number of them because I used to work in a lot of different Christian spaces. And this was different. And if you know anything about Celtic Christianity, you probably understand why, because the monks that arrived in Celtic lands kind of got there before the Roman edicts about how you have to do church. And so when the monks arrived, they built their monasteries around these communities of people, and they built relationship. And they said, oh, you have this celebration that honors the beginning of spring. That's really interesting. We have a saint that kind of goes along with all these things you're talking about. We do these prayers 3 times a day. You're welcome to join us with that. We'll join you in your ceremonies, and instead of competing with the paganism of the spaces, they kind of married their Christian beliefs and the pagan practices and beliefs and created a version of Christianity that we don't really see very much here. A lot less about sin and redemption and all of that, and a lot more talk about presence, the divine presence in nature and in other people. So I'm listening to this podcast for 8 hours that keeps circling back around to this idea of seeing God in everything and everyone. And I think, oh, we've got a principle that kind of sounds like that. We talk about seeing the inherent worthiness in every person. And maybe that is kind of like recognizing that when I encounter another human being, I'm encountering a part of God. And that I am a part of God in that encounter. And you don't have to believe in God to know what that ought to be like. A part of God encountering another part of God. And I have a lot of human interactions that don't look like that. I could show up differently to some of those spaces if I think about a part of God interacting with another part of God. And maybe nature is that too. Maybe nature is a part of God waiting for me to be in relationship with it. And so I show up to this spiritual directors conference with all of this percolating. And a spiritual directors conference it's interesting. A lot of spiritual directors are inter-spiritual. So they say things like, well, I come from a Roman Catholic tradition, but I practice this tarot spirituality reading that I do that's really meaningful to me, and I do this Buddhist meditation thing. And so it's really UU, actually, because they pull from different spiritual spaces. They don't have a lot of hard boundaries about things. Which is interesting, because when I first entered a Unitarian Universalist space, I really didn't know what to expect my first time in the doors. Maybe some of you remember your first time in the doors of a Unitarian Universalist church. And I almost didn't come back, because there were pieces of the service that really did not feel like they were for me. We sang songs that had lyrics that I couldn't agree with. Now I know that UUs just read ahead and try to figure out if they're going to sing that verse or not. But my first time in the door, I didn't know that. And there were some things that were said from the pulpit that I really didn't agree with, and it didn't really resonate with me, and I thought, this really isn't for me. But there was enough that was for me that I kept coming back and giving it a try. And eventually I got to the point where I decided, oh, some pieces of this are not for me. This 4 minutes of the service is not for me. This is for somebody else, somebody on the other side of the room that I care about now because I've been coming here for a little bit. So somebody in the room is finding this meaningful and valuable, but this 4 minutes is not for me. Some of you might be in that kind of space on Sunday mornings, and you say, there's this piece of the service that we do that is just not for me, but there's this other piece I like a lot. But then I got to a point where I was saying, if this 4 minutes isn't speaking to me, what do I do with that time? Do I just wait it out? Or do I use that time in some way? Is that the time that I'm supposed to be reflecting on something that was meaningful for me earlier in the service or earlier in the week? Or is that time that I'm supposed to be sending love and care to those people on the other side of the room that are finding this part of the service meaningful? Is this my time to really just send love to those folks? I'm not getting nourished by this little 4-minute piece, but I could nourish other people with my love and care, which I've mentioned a couple of times about how we might treat our joys and concerns time if you're one of those folks that sits in the pews. Maybe that time is for me to be doing something. So I arrive at the Spiritual Directors Conference. There's a lot of interspirituality among the people, my peers who are there, but the speakers are not all coming from an interspiritual space. A lot of them have a really specific spiritual tradition. Last summer, we talked a lot about the work of Valerie Kaur, who comes from a Sikh tradition. Unapologetically, she comes from a Sikh tradition, but she does a good job of translating things so that it kind of applies to everybody. All of the speakers do not do that well. And so I find myself needing to translate things. And so one of the speakers is saying some stuff, and I think, this part of the conference is not for me. And maybe because I had been spending 8 hours with this Celtic Christianity stuff on the way there, another part of me said, Or maybe this part is specifically for me. Which was unusual, these little parts of myself arguing with each other. Not really. But I paid a little more attention. I dug in a little bit and I said, maybe this is really, really for me, even though this is not language that I would normally use. Maybe this is something that is really, really that I need to hear. One of the speakers, a Christian contemplative named James Finley, said a phrase that I've really, really been living with. Adopting an inner stance that is least resistant to whatever, fill in the blank. So if I feel the need for healing in my life, I can be really aggressively trying to make that healing happen, and that may or may not be effective. Or I might adopt the inner stance that is least resistant to healing, which might be a healing in and of itself. So I adopted an inner stance that was least resistant to what the speaker was saying. Maybe this is specifically for me. It was a good conference. It was a lot of good stuff. And then I had to drive home, 8 hours more on the road. And because I am a completionist, which not only means I watch a lot of bad movies because they're sequels, but because I'm a completionist, I said, well, I should listen to the rest of this Celtic Christianity podcast. So I listened to the rest of the run on the way home. I think I'm adopting an inner stance that is least resistant to God, maybe. A God that I can't define or expect. And I would still call myself an atheist in a lot of ways. There are a lot of gods I don't believe in. And maybe knowing all of the gods that I don't believe in, some of them that I grew up with and spent a lot of time with and just cannot believe in, maybe knowing all of those gods that I don't believe in and can't believe in allows me to adopt an inner stance that is least resistant to encountering and being in relationship with a God that I can't expect or define. Maybe. And so I find myself thinking about things like, what does it mean to be guided by the Holy Spirit for somebody that doesn't really believe in the Holy Spirit, but that understands an inner discernment, and I can think about what's motivating me to send this email? Am I sending this email out of a sense of needing to defend myself? Am I sending this email out of love for this other person, out of compassion? Am I over-functioning in sending this email out of my own anxiety? This discernment, if I go through and really am conscious about what's going on within me. Maybe that's what some of these Christians are doing when they're communing with the Holy Spirit and seeking guidance. I don't know. I don't know what's going on in their heads. But I can know what's going on in mine. I can have the narrative of nature and the narrative of my life and recognize what's going on inside of me right now. And what does that call me to do in my relationships with the world and with other people? Which is what Ursula Goodenough calls spirituality. And so as we go through our summer series on religious naturalism, I invite you to adopt an inner stance that is least resistant to whatever nature has in store for you. We'll talk about some scientific things, but we're always going to try to make it come back to that sense of the personal and what our calling is with other people. And the truth of the matter is, nature is not waiting for us to recognize her. Nature is not hiding from us. Nature is vulnerably exuberant in expressing all that nature has to express with abandon. There is nothing nature is waiting for that relies on us. Maybe waiting for us to wake up and do some of the healing work that we need to do. But nature's not really waiting for that. Nature's just careening on ahead, doing the best that it can with what it has to work with, and offering us gifts if we're willing to pay attention to it. And so that's the invitation, to pay attention, to not just be satisfied with the facts, and the specifics of the narrative, but to allow it to be our narrative and to allow it to call us forward in a meaningful way. And so as we prepare to sing a final hymn together, I invite you into a moment of reflection, prayer, blessing, whatever this might be for you. Just a moment to take in personally. May our inward senses be so attuned to the world around us that we find connection with the scientific story shared by every person. May we fearlessly feel the depth of our emotional response to that story, the full breadth of wonder and awe and gratitude. And may we allow that internal response to overflow into our external connections with one another and the world around us in expressions of love and solidarity and joy. Amen, and blessed be. I invite you to rise in body or spirit as we sing hymn number 1068 in the teal hymnal, Rising Green. If you are joining us online and found this meaningful, I invite you to like, share, subscribe. Don't just do one, do all of them. Like, share, and subscribe. If you're here today and you think that somebody might appreciate this service, you can send it to them and help expand our cyberspace ministry, which sounds very, very 21st century. We have a building tour today if you're interested in There's the sign. That sign and that person will be up here by the piano after the service, and Carol will be happy to tell you all about our building and the exciting things that are happening here. Reverend Shirley, is it raining outside enough that we're going to cancel the Labyrinth Walk, or are we a go for the Labyrinth Walk? What do you say? Okay. So we're going to go for the Labyrinth Walk. Reverend Shirley Nelson is here as a guest to help lead that time of reflection and meditation. And if you don't mind a little damp ground, the labyrinth out on this side of the building is going to be available to you today. And it'll still be available until 11 o'clock tomorrow if you can't stay after the service today. But Reverend Shirley won't be here until 11 o'clock tomorrow. If you want the Reverend Shirley experience, you have to do it after the service. July 9th, next Sunday, we're going to have our free cycle set up, hopefully outside. If the weather's like this, it might be in the fellowship hall. And we also have the Moises Borges concert, which is also hopefully going to be outside. So bring a picnic lunch and plan to hang out for a while, and you bring your favorite, most comfortable lawn chair and enjoy the concert next week. Also, I just want to let you know that Alan, Georgia, and I are planning some weird experiment. Speaking of podcasts, we are thinking about a UUCC podcast where we talk with various people about their spiritual practices that may not be typical spiritual practices that we normally think about, but ways that people connect with their spiritual selves. And we're going to start this off by an Ask Us Anything invitation. So if there is something you want to ask Alan or I, here's your opportunity. And maybe we will use that question on some of the initial episodes of this podcast. And if none of you listen to it, then maybe we'll just say we're not going to do a podcast. But we've got this experiment in mind. We've got time set aside for it. And in your weekly newsletter coming up on Thursday, there will be a link for you to click to get to a Google form to ask us anything. And then Alan and I will look at it and say, you people are just bizarre with the things you want to know about. But we might answer some of those questions. A lot of times as Unitarian Universalists, I think we learn a little bit about a faith tradition, sometimes the most toxic things about a faith tradition, and we say that is not for us, and we cut ourselves off. I think I do that. I've heard some other people say things that suggest we may do that we cut ourselves off from the possibility that there might be something for us, really, really specifically just for us, from unexpected places. And so as we go forth from this place, may we have an openness that allows us to be discerning, but not hardened against all that life has to offer us and all that nature has to teach us. Go with peace and courage.
Let us extinguish our chalice on the back of your yellow card. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we keep in our hearts until we are together again.